And there's a whole conversation out there about how Indigenous thinking can change the world and save humanity from climate change, and maybe holds a lot of the answers. But for me, it's that understanding of coming into a relationship with things from a different place.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Liminal Space. This is actually episode number 10, which is the first small milestone. So I just wanted to take a quick second to say thanks to everybody that's supported what I'm doing and my vision so far. So if you've been watching on YouTube, thanks for watching and sharing. Please feel free to subscribe and hit the bell button below to be notified of all new episodes. And if you're listening, please feel free to rate it. And if you think it's worth 5 stars, that would be amazing. So today I'm in discussion with Hineani Tunoa Roberts. Hi, Hineani.
Hi, David.
Nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Very nice to come and talk with you.
That's a pleasure. I wanted to do something a little bit different in the introduction today. Normally I introduce the guest, but I know that what we're going to be talking about today is really based around who you are and your identity and how you'll see yourself in the world. So it was sort of felt more appropriate maybe if you could introduce yourself.
Well, there's different ways of me introducing myself, I guess. My name is Hineani, and I'm a media artist and run a design media art studio here in Melbourne. And I work in kind of cultural education and community art facilitation as well. I'm kind of moving more into that space. And I have a personal practice as well with my art, which involves a bit of a mashup between modern design, modern printmaking, and some kind of traditional elements from my cultural background. So I guess if I was at a party with someone and they said, hi, who are you? I'm meeting you for the first time. What do you do? That's generally the answer that I give people. I also have a Māori background. So in the Māori world, I would introduce myself first of all with where it's a land-based introduction. So I would say, my ko Manawari te Mona, ko te Arai te Awa. So my mountain is Manawari, my river is te Arai. My people are Rongowhakaata from Tairāwhiti on the east coast of New Zealand. My hapu is Ngāti Kaipoho, and I'm Hineani. So the last thing I would tell you would be my name. Yeah, and the first thing I would tell you is the land that I'm associated with and the group of people that I come from. So they're my introductions.
Wow, it's beautiful. I mean, yeah, it's worked out perfectly, allowing me to introduce yourself. So my understanding is you have Australian and Maori parents.
Yeah. So my mother's Australian. And so she was born in a private hospital in Paddington. She's like 4th generation white settler Australian, mostly from an English background and a little bit of Scottish. And my father is a Māori man. He also has some Scottish in his whakapapa, which is the Māori word for genealogy. So I've got a lot of Scottish in me as well. Yeah, he came over to Australia when I was very young. So I've spent most of my life growing up in Australia, but as a Maori person, which is an interesting combination, kind of living very much. I was raised with these 2 worldviews, my mother's worldview and then my father's Indigenous worldview.
Yeah. I'm sure there's been some struggles that you may have faced having these 2 identities in some way, but I also believe that it gives potentially a really interesting insight into how you see the world because, well, let me ask you, I mean, has this identity really shaped, or how has this identity shaped your worldview?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, yeah, I think it colors everything that I do and see. For a long time, there's a lot of differences between my mother's and my father's culture, and I was raised primarily by my father. My father was my primary caregiver until I was about 12. So I think that's possibly why his Maori tanga or his Maori culture had such a big impact on me. I feel like my first worldview is a Maori worldview, actually, even though I grew up in Australia, in normal kind of suburban Sydney, Australia. But I grew up fishing on the beach and in the garden with him. And I didn't learn to read or write till I was 14, which is really interesting experience, which is a big part of that story for me. And I was diagnosed with dyslexia, but also I think my father actually didn't really have super strong literacy skills. You know, he came from an oral culture where my mother was very word orientated. And so I guess written language wasn't so important, and it just I was raised on oral stories. I was raised on information that was passed down through storytelling. So I think that actually really shaped my brain. And there are studies. There's actually there's a lot of studies on how reading and writing actually changes your brain, and cultures that are kind of orally based. Although, I mean, it's kind of a crazy thing to say that. You know, I grew up in the kind of early 80s, late 70s. So it's a crazy thing to be talking about now, because Maori culture is not an oral culture anymore, predominantly. But yeah, so I guess that's an unusual experience, which definitely shaped the way I saw the world. So for a long time, words were just these really interesting black and white shapes for me, letters. They just were patterns because they didn't have any meaning for me. And I really remember that really strongly because I was so much older when I actually learned to read. My mother's worldview was, I guess, a very sort of English Christian-based worldview. And, it was I think the differences, that hers was very individualistic and my father's was very a collective worldview. Hers was very, very word orientated. She was actually a librarian and a school teacher, so she was very word orientated. Where my father's worldview was, he very oral. He didn't actually ever teach me anything. I probably learnt thousands of things from my father, but he didn't ever sit me down and teach me anything. I learnt just by being at his foot and following him around and doing with him. Where my mother was very instructional. She was a school teacher and she would actually teach you things. So it was a very different way of learning between the two of them. And the other main difference I think that's really affected me is, my mother's world was very task orientated and my father's world was relationship orientated. Yeah, so, and that relationship is not just around people, but relationship to everything. So he entered everything he did, into our Maori, in the Maori world. There's this concept that everything has a mauri, everything has an essence. Our house does, the dog, even inanimate objects. And so we come into relationship with everything that we interact with. And so in a Maori way, his way would be, there was a care of things that was quite different. And not that my mother wasn't caring of things at all, but sense of ownership and his sense of responsibility to other things was quite different because it was all about his relationship to that thing.
That word essence, it's a beautiful word. It's a fascinating word. When I heard it from your mouth now, I started to think, does that mean that these objects or objects, here is my Western world coming into play again, I'm referring to them as objects, but does it mean that perhaps they're alive or they're conscious or they have an awareness about them? Is this something that am I touching on?
I'm not sure it would be described like that as a consciousness, but I guess the Māori of things is definitely something that strengthens the more you look after it and care for it. So something that has really strong Māori would be something like, it might even be a pounamu or a tonga that's passed down, and it's worn by many generations, and it grows. The Māori of it, the strength, the mana of it kind of grows because it's been cared for and it's taken on the energy of those people that have worn it, or the people that have cared for it. Yeah.
No, that's a beautiful way. That's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, Maori spirituality is complex, and I'm definitely not an expert on that. That's my understanding.
And from your father's influence and your mother's, were they individual influences in the sense that the way that you were brought up by your father, is that a common Maori way of bringing people up, or your father had this particular way of living in the world?
I think it probably was. I think definitely in the Maori world, men have play a strong role in caretaking. There's definitely it's quite uncommon, I think, in white Australia to be raised by your father, perhaps, as a young child. Maybe only if something bad had happened to your mother, if your mother had died or was unwell or not available somehow. We're definitely, I think it's definitely more common that men play sort of nurturing roles with their children and their grandchildren. Yeah, and I think that way of being in the world and with the world. Yeah, I think my father was very Maori in that regard. Yeah.
And did you have any conflicts as a child in these two worldviews?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Growing up in these two worlds and trying to reconcile that. I think for a really long time I had this kind of cultural dysphoria, which is what I call it, and for a long time, people would say, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm Australian," and they go, "Oh, you don't look Australian." You'd say, "Oh, I'm Maori," and they go, "Oh, you're not fat enough to be Maori." I tell that story, but so I ended up not saying anything for a long time because I didn't kind of know where I fitted, and neither answer seemed to be acceptable to anyone. So it's sort of a question that I would dodge for a long time. And also, growing up in Australia as a Maori has a layer itself because, there's a lot of Maori people in Australia that kind of feel like if you're Maori outside of New Zealand, you're not proper Maori either, and so that had a whole layer of reconciling it in itself. But it would play out with things like, for example, my father would pick puha. Puha is like a green that grows wild, and we put it in soup. It's really, it's like a superfood, and it, you'd say like, puha's like, it makes you strong and mighty. And he'd just go and collect it from the street verge or the weeds in the ditch wherever it was growing, And my mother would say, "I can't believe you're picking weeds out of somebody else's yard." It's really like an English response. So they had this. Yeah, there was a lot of strangeness. One day I would be barefoot running on the beach fishing, and the next day I would be dressed up going to visit, our Australian family, where we'd have to sit very quietly, and, children were kind of very much seen and not heard, and we'd have to sit quietly in these kind of prickly, uncomfortable clothes and weren't allowed to move and play until the adults had finished talking, and then maybe at the end of the long lunch we'd be able to go outside and pick flowers in the garden. That was like kind of the world. Yeah, but my mother registered my name in English as Anne. Anne is the English translation of Hineani, and she told me that it's you're half white, and that's the most important half. So I understand why she did that. I understand that she was wanting to make life easier for me, and if as a half caste kind of native. The word was native back then. We didn't really, when I grew up, I never heard the word Indigenous. We were called native kids. Yeah, I think she was trying to protect me, and if she could emphasize the white part of us and the Australian part of us, that our world would be easier. But in doing that, it created a lot of difficulty for me because I didn't feel able to safely express, my Maori identity. And I look Maori, I don't look Scottish. I have just as much Scottish, but I don't look Scottish. Yeah, so that's kind of my childhood background. And I mean, there are lots of gaps. My father didn't have language. He grew up in New Zealand where, kids were smacked at school for speaking Māori. My grandma Tui grew up in a fluent speaking house, but at some point stopped speaking and didn't pass that on to my father. So, there are gaps. There's lots of colonization. Yeah, it has a massive impact and it's ongoing, and it's definitely not, we don't live in a post-colonial world by any means. And I think the advantage of being the half-caste, I mean, I've kind of taken that word on to be a positive thing. It was such a disparaging word, it was used, the half-caste, so-and-so. But I'm reclaiming that word because I actually think, it does mean that I can navigate both worlds. I can speak on behalf of white settler Australians because that's in me as well. And I can also speak on behalf of my Indigenous colonised worldview. And so I've learned to navigate life now as, I'm Australian, I'm Maori, and I'm not half anything. I'm both those things. And I think there is advantage in being able to bridge those worlds.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's also some small similarities in my own upbringing. I'm a grandson of Italian migrants, and in Australia, growing up, experienced a lot of racism, and a lot of it was around this word "wog." And then in my lifetime, I've seen it actually be reclaimed by Italians, by Greeks, by people that this word was used as an insult, and actually reclaim it in some way to empower ourselves, And so that was, I mean, it's a perfect sort of extended introduction, and the way that we got in contact yesterday was on social media, and we started discussing, I heard for the very first time, colonial capitalism. And I wanted to start with your introduction because, just jumping into colonial capitalism without knowing where you're coming from may not have been so clear. So what's colonial capitalism?
Yeah, I'm sort of surprised that that word is not more familiar, really. Yeah, so this is my whakaaro, my thinking around it. Colonialism is an expression, an extension of capitalism. So, in my thinking, capitalism kind of peaked around, sort of 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, and into the sort of early 1900s, maybe up until, the World Wars. That was kind of the peak of it in a way. And this is my view. This is totally just my personal view. I'm not an academic scholar. I'm not an economist, but, this is my thoughts. And, colonialism was European countries basically running out of resources. If you look at what the definition of capitalism is, which is the exploitation of resources for profit, capitalism is based on the theory of perpetual expansion or perpetual growth. Now, when you run out of resources in Europe, you go looking for other places and other lands. And that's what colonization is. It was England going out, deliberately seeking other lands in order to harvest the resources from those lands. Now, that's not a story around colonialism that we're comfortable with, and it's not a story that is taught to us in schools. There's a document, a legal basis for this, which is called the Document of Discovery, which I'm only just learning about myself now, which was written like the late 1400s. And it's the legal basis for colonization, basically that Christian countries had the authority of God to go and dominate over non-Christian lands. And you can Google the doctrine of discovery. There's heaps of information out there about that. And that law is, our law is still based, in Australia and New Zealand and in a lot of colonized countries, is still based on that doctrine of discovery. So I think a really good example of colonial capitalism is Britain. Britain's 200-year occupation of India. India now we kind of regard as one of the poorest countries in the world. But for those 200 years that Britain colonized India, they extracted $45 trillion of resources out of India. So why is India the poorest country in the world? Like, colonization was not about Captain Cook just floating around, having a holiday on a boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and happening to chance upon these nice lands and thinking, hey, this would be a nice place, let's come and hang out here. It was a deliberate policy around looking for more resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that those resources were then stolen, in my view anyway, and in most Indigenous people's view, without sovereignty and without consent, those resources were stolen from those peoples and those places for the purpose of profit and wealth.
And your particular background, or as in identity, your mother's background, your father's background, as well as being sort of like one foot on both sides of the fence, do you actually feel that you have one foot in the colonizer world and one foot in the colonized world? Yeah,
absolutely. It's actually dominates my life, actually. And I don't even necessarily realize to what extent until something will happen and I'll start to think about those things. But I am the colonizer and the colonized myself. And like a really good example of that, even just in my New Zealand history, is, my great-grandmother, Hineani Tunoa, was living kind of 1800s. She was born early 1800s, just as New Zealand, the peak, as New Zealand started to kind of really be colonized by English settlers. So she lived in a time when land was confiscated. The Maori Wars were breaking out over land and down on the East Coast. And she kind of lived in this very unsettled time of displacement and unsettlement, as there were clashes between those two worlds, colonial New Zealand and the Maori world. At the same time, and so she grew up in a place where our marae, our carved meeting house, was stolen, was packed up by, Colonel Briggs and one of the English authorities on a barge and shipped off with the intention to sell those carved panels back to England at the time. And it never left New Zealand, thankfully, but it's still now in Te Papa Museum in Wellington, those artefacts. And that's the marae that my grandmother would have visited and gone to when she was a little girl, my great-grandma. So I can't go back to New Zealand and visit. I have to go to Wellington, to the museum, to go to that marae. The ownership of it was only handed back 2017 to the Rongowhakaata people, to my iwi. So that's only 2 years ago that stolen carved house was actually handed back, but it's still in Wellington. So when I go back to New Zealand and I go back to my grandmother's land and I go back to my ancestral homelands, those stories are very real for me. It took us 20 years to get the land records from the Māori Land Court, for example, to even find out where my grandmother's land is. And there is still a lot of land claims that are not settled, and there's still a lot of discomfort around that. By the same token, at the same time, my other great-grandmother, my Scottish great-grandmother, whose name was Jane Roberts, and that's where the Roberts comes from, she came over from Aberdeen, Scotland, with her husband and a couple of kids, and they took up a freehold parcel of land in the Waikato. And the story goes that she had 12 children. She birthed 12 children on her own in a farmhouse with no family and no support. And there was the same, a lot of skirmish over land. And at night, her husband would go out and help the farmers in the area as they fought the Māori who were coming to take their land back. And she didn't know if his head was going to be on a spike in the pa in the morning. And they would be locked in the house. So her and 12 children would be locked in the house while that happened. And I mean, what a wahine toa she was. And that's the expression for a courageous woman. I mean, that Scottish woman, 12 kids on her own, locked in the house, you know, trying to protect her own Māori of her family. Yeah, so both of these women are in me, you know, the settler and the colonised woman. And I guess when people say, hey, you're really strong, I go, oh, you got no idea, man. Like, I got the strength of, you know, both of those cultures. And then there's the story of being here on Australia, and I'm a visitor here. I am Australia, you know, it's the only colonial country that does not have a treaty with its Indigenous people. So here I am, and you know, what am I here? You know, I come from people who migrated to this country. I'm invited into relationship with this land and this place.
And it seems that you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but have you been on a personal discovery of finding out more about your Maori culture and bloodlines, perhaps? And if that's the case, and tell me if it's not, why do you think that you have resonated so much and pursued that part of your identity and not perhaps the Scottish or the colonizer identity? Why is the colonized part of your life so strong for you?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that I've always been in this place. I think probably people that would have known me 20 years ago, I definitely didn't have a stronger Māoritanga as I have now. Maybe I did in different ways, but I definitely didn't express it. It wasn't safe necessarily to express it. That's for a lot of my life, I didn't feel that it was safe to express my Māori identity, and that part of me was definitely smaller. And I'm sure there's lots of people that can relate to this. You know, there's lots of people I know that tell me they relate to that story. It was easier to be Australian. It was easier to call myself Anne and not Hineani. You know, when you introduce yourself, what's your name? Hineani. What is it? Oh, Anne. Oh, okay. That's easy. We get that. And so, I've definitely been on a process of decolonizing myself in a way and decolonizing that story. After my father died, my sister and I spent a lot of time trying to put together those missing pieces of his life and the unresolvedness around some of his story. And that took us on a massive journey of like 20 years long. And at the same time, you know, as a little girl, if someone said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would, I want to be a Maori. I want to be like my dad, you know. I felt cross that I didn't get to grow up in New Zealand like my elder sisters did, and I was stuck here in Australia, you know. It's an interesting thing, you know. I mean, in some ways, it's definitely easier to rest on the side of the colonizer than the colonized person than the colonizer. I think it's a much harder, it's a different story. I mean, there's a lot of lack of privilege in my family. You know, our family lands were confiscated. My father had no money, no inheritance, you know. If I look at, even today, if I do a privilege walk, you know, that exercise where you take the steps, where they ask you questions, you know, I'll often end up at the back of that group of people. And I came home one day and, after an exercise like that, and said to my my teenage girl, hey, like, had this experience today. And she was like, yeah, we did that at school and I always end up at the back too. It's kind of interesting how there's this generational impoverishment that gets handed down when one culture takes all the wealth and resources.
Can you explain that? I'm nodding my head, but I don't actually, I don't really know this privilege activity that you mentioned.
Privilege walk. Yeah,
Privilege
sure.
walk.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, I did emerging cultural leadership mentorship at Fitzroy Community Arts Centre last year. And it was an awesome program. Super recommend it to anyone, any creative people to do. But part of it is about coming into leadership in your cultural identity in a way. And so a privilege walk, you can also Google this. It's an exercise where basically a group of people, you all start in one row at the back of the room and a series of questions is read out. And every time you can answer yes, you take a step forward. So it might be things like, did your parents pay your school fees for you? Did you have to work part-time as a child to support your family? Do you have access to the internet? Do you have a mobile phone? Do you own your own house? Do you rent? These kinds of questions. And it's really, it was quite confronting because I would have said before doing that exercise that I was a really privileged person. And I am. And it is contextual as well, obviously, to who else is in that room. I got access to awesome education. I live in this very safe country where, we have social security. We don't go without food, and, we have free access to health, and that is all privilege. But on the other hand as well, if I compare myself, I'm a single mum, I have 4 children, and it's a very Maori thing to have a big family, which actually disadvantages me in this capitalist game. Capitalism doesn't reward me for having 4 children, and being out of the workplace for 20 years while I raise those 4 children. That is not, I'm not economically rewarded for that. I don't own my own home. I live with one of my children's an adult, 3 of my children still in a 2-bedroom house, in crowded conditions. And when, a lot of Maori people are still really struggling with drug and alcohol abuse, family violence. I mean, I have those in my story as well. Incarceration rates, which are the highest in the world, the same as Australian. These things impact us generationally. When land is confiscated from my grandmother, that takes away her means to actually support herself with growing food or fishing or harvesting food. So what does she do? She has to do, and a lot of the Maori people, and a lot of Australian Indigenous people, exactly the same story. They then leave their rural areas and they go to urban centres. They don't speak English necessarily. They've not got the same level of education. So they get they get the low grade working class jobs. They work in the freezer works, in the factories, the low paid jobs. They end up living in the cheap slum areas. What colonial capitalism creates is a slave class of Indigenous and coloured people, which then build that colonial nation. But they don't get a share of the wealth in that. I was listening the other day in one of my cultural education classes to people's stories, and a lot of the women in that class were talking about coming over here on £10 POM scheme, where 1 million British people were encouraged to come to Australia. And New Zealand. New Zealand had the same scheme. They were able to access, cheap fares, £10 to come here to migrate, and then they did have access to work, to cheaper parcels of land, etc. Now, a lot of those stories were really hard, and a lot of these women were telling the stories of their ancestors coming here and how brave they were, how amazing they were to get on a boat and go to the other side of the the planet, to another hemisphere, so far away from their families and starting their life. And that's true. And I absolutely acknowledge for those people, for my own ancestors that did that, like, what an incredible thing for those people to do, for Jane Roberts to travel from Scotland to this unknown place, to set up a farm away from her own ancestral lands. But by the same token, there's another side of that story, and that is, there's stories, for example, of people winning, European and English people in New Zealand, winning parcels of land in a running race. And like our land was confiscated. It's 200 years. We still do not have access to that land. And yet English people were winning it in a running race. Or they were given it like incredibly cheaply and so easily and effortlessly. They were passing out a freehold title of land. So, I mean, for me, that is colonial capitalism, and it still exists today. There is a massive class division between the colonizer and the colonized, and we don't talk about that. We think it's something that happened 200 years ago and we're all over it now. But there is still a massive class division. If you look at the statistics, both in Australia and New Zealand, Indigenous people, as life expectancies 20, 30 years lower, health, education, access to income, incarceration rates, death in custody, all of those statistics, there is definitely, colonization has created a slave class of people by deliberately cultural genocide. We were the dying race. My father was told he was the dying race. There's no point in learning Māori, no good will come of it. We're soothing the pillow of the dying races. And the faster you assimilate, the faster you marry a white woman and you breed out, that Māori, the better off you'll be. And it's my mother's, you're half white and that's the most important half. The more, I still have had people tell me, you're just making life harder for yourself by identifying with your Māori side. Just assimilate. Why would you want to do that? But there's this part of me that's also like, well, I'm not dead yet. The Maori's not actually bred out of us yet. I'm still here for my grandmother, for my ancestors. I'm still here. I'm still speaking Maori, and I'm still, that is a difficult story. And for many years, I was not safe to express my Maori identity. And there is still a lot of dysfunction in my family around this. I have a sister who got very teased at school. She got called Blackie and Cockroach. She does not identify as Maori. If you ask her, she looks way more Maori than me, if there's such a thing as what a Maori is supposed to look like. But she will tell you she's Australian. So, there is pain and discomfort in that story. But by the same token, there is pain and discomfort in the settler story, which hasn't even begun to be unpacked yet in some ways, There is a lot of discomfort in my settler ancestry around being the ones that perpetrated that imbalance of power. Yeah. And so both of those things, I have to reconcile both of those things within myself.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity for this chat, and for it's very interesting. I mean, so many of these things there are thousands of discussion points just from there. But it's wonderful. And what I'd like to do is, two things. First, just respond this idea of privilege. The way I see it is that it's often too easy for the privileged, of which I definitely am. I pretty much tick so many of those boxes. I mean, I'm healthy, I'm educated, I've got 2 passports, I'm white, and dare I say it, I'm a male. In a global context, those things put together make me a very powerful person. I'm privileged, but I didn't do anything to get that privilege, or these are just the roll of the dice and the way it was rolled for me. But the way that I understand privilege is that and disadvantage. I would say that perhaps disadvantage is the opposite of privilege, is that just very slight privileges and very slight disadvantages compounded on top of each other are what actually creates this huge gap. I mean, if I have access to things and someone does, if I have access to education and someone doesn't have access to that same education, I have already, the gap exists, but I can use that education to further increase that gap. Whereas if I didn't have that education, I may not be really aware or have the tools to know how to bring that gap closer. So over time, those privileges or lack thereof sort of compound, and the gap gets bigger, is the way that I see it. And almost by definition, capitalism for me is exactly this. If I have $1 in my pocket, it means that I can do something with that dollar. I can invest it. To try to make it $2. Of course, I can lose that dollar, but if I don't have that dollar in the first place, I don't have any way to move forward or to work towards, improving our situation. So what I'd like to do is to bring the chat to the current, to the present, to hear, what we can do through your own lens of the world, moving forward in the sense. So what I haven't done in any of these discussions is actually explain the name of this podcast, and I think this is a perfect opportunity to do that. So a liminal space is, for me, a really interesting concept, and it does traditionally come from an anthropological, it's an anthropological term, and it means, or let me give an example. In many cultures, many indigenous cultures, many tribal cultures, there's a period of transition or initiation. A boy becomes a man, a girl becomes a woman. But what happens in that time between when you're no longer a boy and no longer a girl, and you're not yet a man and not yet a woman? And this space is a liminal space. And unfortunately, I find that right at this moment, the world is in this liminal space. We don't really know what the future is going to look like, and it, in the last 6 months, more than ever, the whole thing has been turned on its head. And I'm hoping to have these sorts of discussions with people like yourself that think different. I can't say think differently, but just bring a different perspective to their thought than the sort of the more regular and mainstream narrative. So your relationship to the world around us, to nature and to connection, how do you feel about this currently, in the past, and moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot over this COVID time is, in our what I call, a white Australian, and it is Christian value-based culture. We do think that humanity is the center of the universe, that we're the most important thing and the universe revolves around us. Where in my Māori worldview, we're just one player in a multi-connected web of the natural world. And there is no separation between people and the environment. There's a whakatauki, a proverb in Te Ao Māori, it's really well known, ko o te awa, ko awa te o, I'm the river and the river is me. Ko o te mauna, ko mauna te o, I'm the mountain and the mountain is me. So they are my ancestor and my ancestors. There's no separation between me and them. I am, as a human, I am the consciousness of the natural world around me, of the environment. So when things like COVID come along, my response is kind of, wow, like nature has an intelligence that we don't understand. And what has it got to teach us? what has this virus got to teach us? What is it bringing? You know, I don't think about it as it's the enemy that must be defeated. It's a risk to humanity, and we start using war-like language, and the world becomes very polarized. I definitely don't, have all the answers to this, but I guess what I did when those first rounds of lockdown happens is I just went to a place of what I would call deep listening. So in the Māori word, I call that maramataka, which is listening to the environment. It's listening to the tide of the world. And in Australian Indigenous culture, I've learned that, this word deep listening that's used here, that is something similar. And it's really interesting where, this virus is just shining the spotlight on all the places of inequality and imbalance in our world, aged care, public housing, racial discrimination. The cracks in the walls were already there. And this just puts pressure on them. So, they're going to fall apart now. And I think we're at a point in humanity where that individualistic and capitalist worldview is actually in its extreme expression. The extreme expression of that is narcissism. And look at, look at Donald Trump, for example. He's the president of the biggest kind of economy in the world. Look at Jeff Bezos, where one person can be worth $20 billion. I mean, is that not the ultimate expression of individualistic capitalist culture? That man single-handedly could change the trajectory of climate change. Amazon could buy the Amazon and replant it. And I've been reading Tyson Yonka-Porter's book, Sand Talk.
Okay, I know of this book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I relate to so much of it. In the Māori world, there's a lot of similarities in some of the things that he talks about. And one of the things he talks about in there is sort of rites of passage around, as we come into adulthood, as we come through these liminal spaces. Mm-hmm. In collectivist cultures, one of the rites of passage to coming into adulthood is actually learning that you're not important. You're not important as an individual, but you're part of something which is really important, and you have a role to play in that. And it's not about you as an individual. Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that COVID is teaching us at the moment, it's that, isn't it? It's almost a rite of passage for humanity's narcissism right now, in a way, because we have to start thinking differently.
And what's become apparently clear, and the way you've expressed it is perfectly demonstrates that the way that we see that we are not part of nature means that, like, for example, we're both here in Melbourne. We're locked into our apartment or our house, my apartment, 23 hours a day. And it's seen that going outside is sort of like a privilege. And there were things where instead of you must go outside and be with nobody, by yourself in nature, we're actually being fined if we are outside by ourselves in nature. And we're being told you must be inside your four walls with the internet and Netflix and everything else. And I get it. Like I get where it's coming from, fear, and it's a scary world out there, but we are the world. We are the rivers, we are the sunshine, we are the birds and the bees, and
we are the virus.
We
literally
are the virus.
Virus actually, genetically change us and evolve within our bodies.
And what has brought about, you said that in the last 20 years you've moved towards identifying more with your Maori culture, and perhaps that's changed your worldview as well, which gives me hope that others can do exactly the same thing. I mean, what was that journey? What was the spark of that journey? And how can we, in our own way, how can we begin to think differently about the world around us? How can you point us in that direction from your own experience?
Mm. Yeah, I think for me, the key is coming into relationship with place, like my father. It's coming into a worldview, and whether you call it an Indigenous worldview or a collectivist worldview, and there's a whole conversation out there about how Indigenous thinking can change the world and save humanity from climate change, and maybe holds a lot of the answers. But for me, it's that understanding of coming into a relationship with things from a different place. If you have a relationship to the land and the resources in that land that is your ancestor, and you're in relationship with them, you can't blow them up like Rio Tinto. You can't exploit it in the same way. And I mean, capitalism is based on this perpetual growth, but it's based on resources which are, finite. The natural resources on this planet are finite. So at some point, humanity was going to always get here. It was inevitable that we were going to end up in this place where we ran out of resources. Um, you know, um, I think as a human race of Homo sapiens, we have to start coming into relationship with place, with our sense of place, with each other in a different way. Do I have such an intimate relationship with my environment that my environment would actually feel my absence if I left and moved out of it? That kind of intimate interaction where, the environment is actually also responding to me as much as I am to it. How can we live in a way that is that interrelational? And I think if humans are able to make that transition, the world would be a totally different place. Our economic systems would be different, our relationships with each other, our relationships with the environment, with pollution, they all have to change. So for me, I think you solve all the other problems if you just come back to this place of this relationship base of how am I relating to the world, to my family, to the people I interact with? Am I uplifting the mana of the people around me? Am I caring for the Maori of the people and the place around me? The park that I walk my dog in, or the bit of bay that we go and swim in on hot days. What is my actual relationship to those places? Do I ask permission when I go into those places? Do I go into them respectfully? Do I treat them as though they actually have a Maori and an essence of their own, and I'm a visitor there? And how do I interact with them in a way? Yeah, I'm constantly asking myself kind of those questions, and I feel like my father did that in quite a natural way, which I definitely wish I did better at. Yeah, I don't have a memory of him ever raising his voice at anyone or being in, there was obviously conflict, but he just had such deep respect. If there's one thing that I could change about humanity, it would be our relationship to respectfulness for each other, for people, for the miracle of life, respectfulness for this earth that, we have a privilege of being a little nano blip in the great history of the universe to live upon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how it's very beautiful to hear these words. How did your father express himself, or how did he teach you these lessons? Was it all through storytelling? Was it through this oral way of which you, I assume, know that you have very much this ability? You are a very passionate communicator. Is that something that you have developed from your father's influence?
Yeah, I would like to think that. I would like to think that I have, learned his ways. I mean, it's not something that I remember learning. It's something that he just was. He was in his being. It's not. I don't even know if that's if it's something you can teach. I feel like I learned it just from being in his presence, and because he was just present with where he was. He wasn't projecting himself always into the future. He was just always present. If he was in the garden, he was in the garden and he was with the garden. If he was fishing and with the ocean, he was in the ocean. If he was cooking in our kitchen, he did everything just with such a sense of respectfulness and presence and of equal relationship to that thing. And I think I learned that just by osmosis in a way. Yeah. I'm not really sure how to answer that question other than that.
No, and I was also in your I read or I heard you talk about this concept in the Maori world of dignity and custodianship. I wonder if you
Yeah,
can talk about that.
yeah. Kaitiakitanga is custodianship, yeah. And the way manakitanga. Manakitanga is the other word, where you care for things. So, I mean, in Te Ao Māori, we have this concept that things have mana. People have mana. So, what is mana? There's no English equivalent for that, but I translate it as dignity. That every living thing has intrinsic dignity. It's not earned. It can't be lost. It's actually our birthright in being a living organism on this planet, and that's your mana. And so you can feed and grow that dignity, or you can do things that diminish it for yourself. But manakitanga is uplifting that. So interacting in the world, that you're everything you do, that you're caring for and you're uplifting the dignity of others. Yeah, it's. I think it's a beautiful Maori concept. It's one of the It's really one of the treasures of Te Ao Māori manakitanga. And to live in that way of, and that's what I'd say my father was practicing, was his manakitanga. Yeah, the things aren't bad or good, or right or wrong, or bad or good. They are what they are. And yeah, if what we can do is to care for them and to uplift them, we also uplift ourselves. You see, this is the other thing, is when you uplift the mana of others, you're actually taking care of yourself. So this concept of self-care, which is such a Melbourne thing, we don't really have a concept of that in a collectivist culture, because when you care for others, you automatically are cared for. There is this individualization of, we have to have self-care because everyone's on their own, and we all have to look after each other. We have to have good boundaries, and we have to have self-care. Yeah, if we're caring for others, we're automatically cared for.
Yeah, I think that's I share with you that view, and thank you again for these beautiful insights and for allowing me to feel free to ask you these questions as well, because very personal insights. So, and perhaps this is the most personal at all, so I hope you don't mind me asking, but you are a mother, and how does that relationship go with your own children, in the sense that you bring them into the world? How do they feel as far as their identity? How do they feel as far as being attached to the land and the people around them? And what's your role as a mother in attempting to teach them in the most sustainable and appropriate way?
Yeah. That's the million-dollar question. I think that is the most challenging thing. Yeah, I've been to lots of different places with that. I think ultimately, I think you can't pass on what you don't own yourself. So in passing on these values that are my values and came from my father and came from my grandmother, and I have to own them and embody them. Oh, I'm using the buzzword embodied. It's, you know, that's such a buzzword at the moment as well. But I actually have to own them, and they have to really be authentically part of me. And then, I mean, I've done my best to teach my children respectfulness with, and you know, I raised them in nature, out on the side of a mountain out in rural Victoria. We didn't have a television. We still don't have a television. You know, they were homeschooled partly. I would take a term off every year and pack the car, and we'd go out and camp in the desert for a month or a couple of months, and they spend a lot of their life in nature. It's quite funny because right now, and you know, now we're in Melbourne, and they're all teenagers, and of course, all they want to do is eat McDonald's and watch YouTube and be normal. We've always had a veggie garden, even in my tiny little world here. We keep bees. We grow our veggies, and yeah, but you know, they're in this funny stage where they just, you know, they want to be teenagers. And you know, sometimes I kind of go, you know, wow, like, how do I pass that Maori tanga on to them? It's super challenging. They identify as Australian. I mean, their father is a Kiwi, but they don't really identify as Maori. They'll say, my mum's Maori, but they don't identify as being Maori. Because that's something that they have to come into their own relationship with themselves. Last February, we all went back to New Zealand, and we had some time on our marae on it, and we slept there, and we had a big whānau hui there, which was really beautiful. I took my nephew with us, and it's interesting though, because in other ways, when my kids are there, they're so comfortable. They were so comfortable in that world as well. So even though they think, you know, that they're not very Maori, they're just probably not old enough necessarily to really understand what that means. But what I pass on to them, I guess, is only what I am in my own presence with them. Really, I think that's what will stick.
I think that's the more grey I get in my beard, the more I understand that we're nothing other than an example. In the words we speak, the actions we do, the way we live our lives. And I don't have any kids, but I can only go back on my own personal journey of self-discovery and identity to do with my Italian upbringing. And it's all about time. There can be the right time. You can't force anything on anybody, I think. But you can teach and you can lead by example, and you put that there for people to either be able to move into or to grow into, you know, or not. It wasn't until I was in my sort of late 20s that I tried to discover my own Italian identity in a way. And if it was forced upon me, I think I would be less inclined to actually want to discover it, I guess, because, you know, I just wanted to move into that space naturally. I did lie. I told you that would be the last question, but we just talked about time, and I want to give you the opportunity as well, because I know that you've got a current exhibition that is in competition as well, and I will leave a link to that in the video and in the audio podcast. So this project, what can you tell us about time?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, it was a work I developed while I was at FCAC last year during the Emerging Cultural Leadership program. And that was my own sort of personal journey of decolonizing my concepts of time. And it totally fits into our conversation, actually. It's probably a nice way to wrap it all up. So I think when it comes to cultural identities, yeah, I mean, they're very personal journeys, and everybody has to work out that for themselves, you know, in this mashup world that we live in now. And I think it's really easy to understand cultural values when we look at things like food or languages. It's really easy to see the differences. But when it comes to something like time, that's something that most people would probably say is a universal truth. We don't necessarily automatically think that different cultures have different concepts of time. Like, that's crazy. There's a clock, there's 60 seconds in a minute, that's time. So I started to, I was working as a paid creative working to deadlines as an hourly rate. That's, how I pay my rent and feed my kids. And it's crazy. It's this crazy system of, commodification of my time, where I sell my time. My time is a commodity that I sell. I need to be productive to make a profit. These are all these like capitalist values, and there's a morality that was attached to that. Idleness is a sin. Wasting time. Not being productive. Like, we're so uncomfortable with not being productive and doing nothing, and yet idleness is so important. It's really important to the creative process to have, just nothing time. I think there was a study done years ago where a whole heap of really creative people interviewed, when did you get your best ideas? And they'd all say, in the shower, or when I was doing nothing, or, Neil Finn used to write his songs as he napped in between sleep and awake. That's actually when the creative brain starts to kick in. So this concept of time is money, and, not enough time, and you're on the clock. And so the work is around that commodification of time and that capitalist concept of time being a commodity. And it's at that point, I describe it as, it was kind of like it was a wallpaper that just painted my world. It was everywhere, and I didn't feel like there was no escaping from that. And in the artwork, that commodification of time, clock time, is represented as this big roll of wallpaper. So I started to kind of really look at Māori concepts of time and Mara Mataka, and started to see that in a lot of other cultures, they don't necessarily run on the same understanding of time. Time is actually a cultural concept. It's not a universal truth. And in a lot of places, we have these expressions: Fiji time, Bali time, Kuri time, Maori time. Time is measured and valued really differently. So, yeah, the artwork is about that. There's these 8 spinning tops that I kind of talk about. I talk about body clock. I talk about all sorts, lunar calendars, stellar calendars, different ways of measuring time. And they kind of interrupt this wallpaper of time as a commodity. And I think that's one of the, that's one of the really big things of colonial capitalism is, there is this layer of a whole different value system on the Indigenous worlds, even the way we measure time, the way we value oral versus written language. Yeah, the way we value an individualist worldview and a collectivist worldview, the way and all those things are kind of ranked as one is important and better and the other one is diminished. So, yeah, welcome to check out the work. It was shortlisted for the Incinerator Award Art for Social Change prize this year, which was amazing and really weird because it's all online and it's an interactive artwork, and because of COVID, the gallery can't open, and so it's all strange.
Well, it's not the only thing strange in the world, so yeah. This is where we're at. As I said, I'll put a link to that so anybody can jump on and vote, and it would be amazing if you won that award. There's
some awesome work in the exhibition. It's a great exhibition, and it was just such a privilege to have work shortlisted there, and there's some really amazing work in that.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much again for the chat, and I'm happy that this very humble platform can give your words and inspiration, more of a chance to get out there and hopefully touch touch a lot of people. So thank you very much. Good luck for the for that award, and we're less than 5 kilometres away, but hopefully we can catch each other, meet in person once these lockdowns are.
Yeah, I would love that, David. Thank you so much for your time
It's a
and
pleasure.
patience.
Thanks, Hineani. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Many thanks for watching. I'd love for you to be notified of new episodes, so subscribe and hit the bell button below. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. You can also visit liminalspace.earth to discover all episodes. But for now, many thanks again, and I'll see you next time in a liminal space.